Hey everybody, it's Dave here from Dragonhill Games, and today we're going to have a look at my Jesaki Control deck. I've been playing this deck for several years, and it does well in the current modern environment. If you're looking for a deck that'll give you a chance to win at any tournament you go to, have a look at this one. Okay, so let's have a look at this Jesaki Control deck. Before I get started, I just wanted to mention a bit about the sleeves. I've been playing this deck for several years, and for the last 2 years or so, I've had it sleeved in these sleeves. First off, Serve Me seems pretty appropriate for a control deck, but besides that, these are Legion double matte sleeves. You should be able to find them at your local game store. I'm not affiliated with Legion, I don't get any kickbacks from this video. Personally, I really like Dragon Shields, but I do want to say I've had these sleeves on this deck for about 2 years or so. They've seen a lot of play. I've never had one split on me, like ever. And they just still feel really good, feel really tight. I can't say enough good things about these sleeves. I'm going to be sleeving most of my decks going forward with these. They are Legion double matte sleeves, and again, you can probably find them at your local game store. Okay, so moving into the deck tech. So we'll start with, we have 3 copies of Serum Visions. I mean, Serum Visions is a great card for any control deck that includes blue, obviously. You know, for 1 blue mana, at sorcery speed, we draw a card and scry 2. So basically just filtering our deck and allowing us to manipulate the top of our deck. So then moving along into the control parts of the deck, we have 4 copies of Remand. I personally think that Remand is one of the best counter spells available to us in Modern. For 2 mana, I mean a blue and 1, we counter target spell. If we do, return that spell to its owner's hand and we draw a card. So basically you're putting your opponent back a turn, especially in the early game when they can't afford to replay the spell again, and then it's replacing itself with the cantrip effect. So just a really good all-around counter spell. Continuing on, we have 3 copies of Mana Leak. Mana Leak is really good in the current modern environment. For 2 mana, 1 blue and 1, we counter target spell unless its caster pays an additional 3. So if you're worried about decks like Hogaak and things like that where they're going to convoke or delve to pay for a lot of their mana costs, this is a perfect card because they're going to have to pay the 3 with mana that they can generate on the battlefield. So they can't delve away or convoke away that additional 3 cost. Just a really good spell. It's almost a 2 mana counter spell in the first 3 or 4 turns, like every time. They're almost never going to be able to pay for this. The one bad thing I will say about Mana Leak, and it's definitely a side out against Tron. Tron generates so much mana, it doesn't care, especially late game, the spell, they just laugh it off, so it's always a side out for me when I'm playing against a Tron opponent. Continuing on, we have 2 copies of Cryptic Commands. What can I say about Cryptic Command? Probably the best counter spell in Modern. 3 blue and 1, we're gonna choose 2 from the following modes: counter target spell, or return target permanent to its owner's hand, or tap all creatures your opponents control, or draw a card. So more often than not, it's gonna be counter draw, you know, counter tap all your stuff, but just really good spell. Basically, you can almost negate an opponent's entire turn with this card. And then I run 1 copy of Condescend. I just find Condescend to be a phenomenal counter spell. 1 blue and X, counter target spell unless its controller pays X, and scry 2. So we have the added bonus of being able to manipulate the top of our library, always good with a control deck. And, you know, counter target spell unless they pay X. So this spell pays off much more later in the game when you have mana available and you can make them pay 4 or 5, whatever you need to do. Just a good all-around counter spell. I run 1 copy. Fitting in with the control theme, Teferi Time Raveler. So 1 blue, 1 white, and 1. We get a Teferi Planeswalker that has a static ability. Each opponent can cast spells only anytime they could cast a sorcery, so really good against things like Infect or against Control Mirror, things like that. I run 1 main board. So his +1s are until your next turn. You may cast sorcery spells as though they had flash, and his -3s return up to 1 target artifact, creature, or enchantment to its owner's hand and draw a card. So I mean, we can drop him, bounce a creature or an annoying enchantment or artifact, replace him with a card right away, and we still have him on board to later cast sorceries as though they had flash and things like that to bring him back up. And I mean, he always has the static ability, which basically shuts off your opponent on your turn. Okay, and then we have one copy of Jace the Mind Sculptor. So I mean, Jace is just, what can you say? It's Jace the Mind Sculptor. I mean, this card was banned for a reason, not saying it needs a reban. I think it's fine in the current modern environment. Just an amazing planeswalker. I mean, you can, for 0, you can brainstorm. For +2, you can Fate Seal your opponent and really mess with the top of their deck. You know, he has a -1, return target creature to its owner's hand, so just a really good control planeswalker, you know, get control of the board and keep it as long as you can protect Jace. So again, excellent choice in this deck. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, again, just one of the premier planeswalkers available to control players. You know, he's bonkers. +1, draw a card at the beginning of your end step, untap 2 lands. I mean, come on, you get to draw a card and have mana open for counter magic. What more can you ask for in a control deck? So, I mean, we all know the benefits of Teferi and fits perfectly in this deck. Okay, so moving on to our removal package. I run 4 copies of Path to Exile. Not probably the best 1 mana cost removal spell in Modern as far as I'm concerned. It has absolutely no restrictions. You can remove any creature if they're exiled, so you don't have problems with them reoccurring. Things like Hogaak, Bloodghast, all those annoying Vengevines, things that just keep coming back, and you know, Phoenixes that come back and annoying you. This just handles those perfectly. Generally, we don't really care that much about giving our opponent a land, although it's a little bit, you know, as the game progresses, the spell becomes more valuable. Having given your opponent free land in the early going, obviously not the best thing you can do, but I mean, it is what it is, and it's still the best removal spell in white for sure at the 1 mana slot. Okay, and so then we run 4 copies of Lightning Bolt. Enough said. 1 red, deal 3 damage. Don't need to explain Lightning Bolt, it's there for a good reason. 4 copies of Lightning Helix, so 1 white and 1 red. We're going to do 3 damage to any target and gain 3 life. Again, pretty self-explanatory. I run currently 1 copy of Anger of the Gods, although if there's no bans to the Hogaak Bridgevine deck, I may consider changing this to 2 copies main board. So Anger of the Gods for 2 red and 1 deals 3 damage to each creature. If a creature dealt damage this way would die in this turn, instead exile it. So really good against decks that have a recursion theme. And then I run 1 copy of Supreme Verdict. Again, probably one of the better removal spells in Modern. So 1 blue, 2 white and 1. Supreme Verdict can't be countered, destroy all creatures. Pretty self-explanatory. And then 4 copies of Snapcaster Mage. So we're moving on to how are we going to win the game now that we've established that we're a control deck. So Snapcaster Mage obviously gives us access to recast our counter spells, recast Path to Exiles, recast Anger of the Gods if we need it, and I can't tell you how many games I've won with just the Snapcaster beats. So it's more often than not, you're keeping your opponent at a point where they have, you know, 0 creatures. So Snapcaster's getting in there for 2, 2, 2. Any damage you can get off with him is a bonus because, I mean, he really is in there to give you access to spells that you've already used out of your hand. And then we have 1 copy of Vendilion Clique. So I'd like to mention with Vendilion Clique, first off, he is a 2 blue and 1, a legendary fairy wizard that has flash and flying as a 3/1 body, so a good beater in its own right. But he's really in here for when he comes into play, look at target player's hand, you may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, that player reveals the chosen card, puts it on the bottom of their library, and then draws a card. So, more often than not, you're going to clique your opponent. You want to just remove something out of their hand that you don't want to deal with, and you're okay with them getting a card from that. But a lot of times you may consider cliquing yourself. So let's say, you know, you've got 6 or 7 lands in play, you're sitting there with, you know, two lands in your hand, or a land and, you know, whatever, a counter spell or something in your hand, and you top deck a clique. More often than not, I'll flash it in at the end of my opponent's turn, and clique myself, you know, and then just pitch whatever I don't need and draw another card. Or I may clique myself in response to my opponent doing something and then hope I hit something off the top that I need. So just a really good universal effect on there. You can either do it to mess with your opponent or do it to help yourself. And again, great beater with evasion, flying 3/1, just getting in there type of thing. So, and lastly, but not least in the creature category, I run one copy of Geist of St. Trapt. So Geist of St. Trapt is a premier beater for control style decks. 1 blue and 1 white and 1. We get a legendary spirit cleric that has a 2/2 body and has hexproof, so he has all he protects himself. But when he attacks, Geist of St. Trapt, whenever Geist of St. Trapt attacks, put a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying onto the battlefield tapped and attacking, exile that token at the end of combat. So just making angels for days, you know, and great finisher to finish off opponents. And then, so moving along to our land package, I run 24 lands in this deck, and this, I'll mention this one first. So Celestial Colonnade, amazing land, comes into the battlefield tapped. We can tap to add a white or a blue to our mana pool, and we can pay a blue, a white, and 3 until end of turn. Celestial Colonnade becomes a 4/4 white and blue elemental creature with flying and vigilance. It's still a land. So this will finish games for you. There'll be plenty of times where your opponent's at 12 life, you've been dominating him or her all game, and you get a Celestial Colonnade, put it into play, and then just start swinging in with that Colonnade to finish your opponent off. And the great thing about it is you can attack with it. It has vigilance, so it doesn't tap, and then you leave it and other mana up available for counter magic on your opponent's turn. I run one copy of Desolate Lighthouse, basically just a loot land. So I can tap it to add colorless mana to my mana pool, and I can pay a red, a blue, and 1, tap it and draw a card and discard a card. Just great for filtering, you know, useless cards out of your hand. So again, that's a 1 of. And then moving on to our fetch shock package. So our fetch targets are going to be, we have 3 copies of Sacred Foundry, 2 copies of Steam Vents, and 1 copy of Hallowed Fountain. And then the fetches we're going to be using to get those will be 2 copies of Scalding Tarn, 4 copies of Arid Mesa. And the remaining lands in the deck are 4 copies of Glacial Fortress. Every land in here except the Colonnade, the Desolate Lighthouse, and the fetches obviously, but every other land in the deck and the 1 basic mountain. Every other land in the deck turns this on, so you know, you're almost never going to be putting this into play tapped. Run 1 basic mountain, 2 basic islands, and 2 basic plains. Okay, so that is the main board. Let's have a look at the sideboard. So in the sideboard I run 2 copies of Surgical Extraction. Pretty self-explanatory. There's many things that this hits in many decks. Currently the big threat is Hogaak Bridgevine. So I mean, you're going to surgical anything that you can get in the yard that's going to disable combo pieces. Blood Gas, you know, Hogaak himself, Altered Dimension if you can get counter 1 and get it in the yard. Just things that are going to great for shutting off decks. 2 copies. 2 copies of Rest in Peace. So again, right now the big threat is the Hogaak Bridgevine deck, and this turns their deck almost entirely off. They have to have a way to deal with it. Probably going to be using Wisp-Mares, so keep your eye out for things like that. 2 copies of Stony Silence, so really good against obviously any artifact decks, so Affinity, Modular Affinity, things of that nature. Of note, with Bridgevine, also shuts off their Altered Dementia. This one I get a little bit of flack for, but I think it's a great include. I run 2 copies of Guttural Response, and the reason why they're in there is for the control mirror. I'll tell you something, your control, if you're playing the control mirror, or white-blue controller, Esper control, whatever, some sort of control opponent, this spell, they will never see it coming. You have 1 red mana open, they go to do something, you Guttural Response, they'll never ever ever see it coming. I've won games just because my opponent will never predict that this is in the deck. Okay, and then I run 2 copies of Wear Tear. So Wear Tear, really useful card against a lot of decks. So it is 1 red and 1, destroy target artifact, or 1 white destroy target enchantment, or you can pay both and fuse them, so 1 white, 1 red, and 1 destroy an artifact and an enchantment. I'm sure you can think of lots of uses for this. An additional copy of Supreme Verdict, 2 copies of Pithing Needle, so more often than not this is, you know, in there for a control mirror. I might want to shut off one of their planeswalkers. Against Jund, you know, I'm going to shut off Liliana or something that's just going to be frustrating and hard for me to deal with. But there's plenty of uses for Pithing Needle, add as necessary. And then the last one, I run 2 copies of Dampening Sphere. So Dampening Sphere is in there for Tron and Storm. Dampening Sphere does hurt us a little bit because there are plenty of times where we're going to be casting more than 1 spell in a turn. But the payoff is, you know, worth it. So we don't want a Storm player to be able to storm off, or for Tron, this is just a really good sideboard card. Okay, so I hope you had enjoyed having a look at my Jesaki Control deck. Well, I hope you enjoyed having a look at my modern Jesaki Control deck. What's your favorite modern deck to play? Let me know in the comments section below. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe yet, please consider doing so. We post at least 2 videos every week. See you soon.